Marshall, and my project this summer was looking at constructed wetlands in the Lower Piasa Creek Watershed to see if they could serve as carbon sinks. So wetlands can provide us with many important ecosystem services, such as habitat and flood control. And because these services are so important that in December of 2002, a national wetlands mitigation plan was announced that declared there would be no net loss of wetlands. And because of this, there's now compensatory mitigation, which simply means if wetlands are taken out of production in one location, new wetlands must be created in another location to make up for that loss. So locally, Great Rivers Land Trust works with businesses that need mitigation solutions through their Piasa Creek Watershed project. And through this project, multiple constructed wetlands or man-made wetlands are now located on land parcels adjacent to Piasa Creek. This summer I conducted soil analysis on 3 of these constructed sites. So we were looking at carbon sequestration on these sites. And what is carbon sequestration? It's simply just storing carbon in the soil. As carbon dioxide, otherwise known as CO2, is released into the air, it causes the atmosphere to heat up, and then a warming atmosphere contributes to climate change, catastrophic weather events, and soils are estimated to hold 46% of the world's organic carbon. So we want to get that CO2 out of the air back into the soil. Right here is just a basic graphic of carbon cycling and sequestration in a wetland. So you can see over there on the far left that in the terrestrial vegetation systems, anaerobic decomposition takes place. This is decomposition at the surface level. And then most of the carbon that's released during that decomposition is released back into the atmosphere as CO2, and very little of it is sequestered into the soil. While over in a wetland system, there's anaerobic decomposition, which means low oxygen, and then there's very little carbon released as CH4 or methane into the atmosphere, but much more of the carbon is sequestered into the wetland. So our objectives this summer were to assess the constructed wetlands for carbon sequestering ability, assess total nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations because these are very important nutrients for plants, determine the soil pH for each wetland. We wanted to visually assess the soil samples for indications of anaerobic conditions, and then provide benchmark data for future research since this is a 3-year REU project. And then here on this photo, we have what we call glaying, and glaying is indicative of anaerobic soil conditions. And these saturated low oxygen soil conditions, iron and manganese will begin to reduce, and that results in that bluish gray colored soil that you can see there. So for my soil extraction, I used a soil core sampler and I sampled the top 15 centimeters of the soil profile. And then back at the lab, I divided those soil cores into 0 to 5 and 5 to 15 segments for processing, and we wanted to compare the concentrations in those profiles. The samples were then weighed and dried, and then 1 gram of soil was processed through an Elementar Max, and it was analyzed for total nitrogen, total organic carbon, and carbon-nitrogen ratio. Then we also wanted to measure for bioavailable phosphorus, so we did the standard Mehlich 3 procedure on that, where we mixed the soil and extraction solution and filtered the samples, and then we did the chemical analysis on a SmartChem 170 discrete analyzer here at the NGRREC lab. The first wetland that I was working in, we titled it the Upper Wetland. It's a 2.5 acre mitigation area located in the Piasa Creek Watershed. There was no evidence of farming in the past 3 years, in the 3 years prior to construction. It contains a remnant slough of Piasa Creek, and the primary vegetation was reed canary grass, emergent aquatic vegetation, such as American lotus and bulrush. The second wetland was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wetland, and I collected my data points within a 15-acre tract that featured 1 wetland cell and a forested strip. And then it was composed of dense stands of reed canary grass and emergent aquatic vegetation. And while we were out there sampling and monitoring, there was actually active spraying for invasive species during this time. And then the last wetland was the largest wetland, and we called that the tiered wetland. It was approximately 66 acres, and then I have that outlined there in red. And then within this tract, wetland cells of varying elevations made up approximately 8 acres, and those are outlined in blue. This wetland was a little bit different from the other two that we had looked at because this one was in continuous row crop farming production for 100+ years. Prior to becoming a mitigation site, we knew that the soil was moved around extensively during construction. And this one had much more diverse vegetation with emergent aquatic vegetation, grasses, shrubs, and trees. So when it came to our results, we found that each wetland had its own unique pH range. We can see that the upper wetland has a pH of 7.59, and the Army Corps of Engineers has a pH of 8.02, and those are average soil pHs for this area. And then the tiered wetland is slightly more acidic, it's 6.15, and we are not sure if that's the natural pH of the soil or if the past farming practices could have led to the acidification of the soil in that wetland. Soil acidifies by nature, so if whoever was farming it didn't apply the proper amendments, it would have acidified, and then synthetic nitrogen fertilizer can also cause acidification of the soil. When it came to total organic carbon, our ideal carbon concentrations range from 2 to 5%. And the highest concentrations of carbon were found in the 0 to 5 centimeter segments, which are represented in blue on that chart. And that's what we had expected. And then the upper wetland was the highest percent of carbon sequestered. In the tiered wetland, when it came to the total organic carbon, we found that our carbon concentrations in the 0 to 5 centimeters were related to elevation. So I'm going to step away here for a second. I tried doing the elevation thing in Google Earth, but it's not much of an elevation drop, but from right here is 440 feet, and then down here at the outlet is 430 feet. So the edges here are higher in elevation, and then it just kind of gently slopes towards the center and then to the outlet. And it's not much of an elevation change. But we're finding that it appears that as the water is moving through the wetland, it's picking up particulate carbon and depositing them in the wetland cells. Because you can see on cell 7, we're 435, cell 6 is 434, and our cell number 1 next to our outlet is 430. So as our water and our carbon is moving through the wetland, decreasing in elevation, our concentrations are actually increasing. And then I took some baseline measurements at the southeast and northeast edge, and we can see the 0 to 5 centimeter concentrations are really significantly lower, and what we might be looking at in those two spots is active erosion, where the top organic layer is eroding away. When it came to total nitrogen, we measured organic and inorganic forms of nitrogen. Normal range for A horizon soils, which would be like that 0 to 5 centimeter profile, would be 0.02 to 0.5%, and for a reference point, cultivated soils like agriculture soils would want a percent around 0.15. And then once again, the upper wetland had the highest concentration of average total nitrogen. When it came to phosphorus, we're kind of running out of time, so we only measured the 0 to 5 centimeter segments. 50 milligrams per kilogram is considered sufficient for agricultural crops. So if we're using that reference point, you can see that all the wetlands would be slightly deficient, but what really stands out on this graph is you can see how much higher the Army Corps of Engineers wetland is in comparison to the other two. And we speculate that may be because they were spraying for invasive species during our time there. The dead and dying reed canary grass releasing the phosphorus through active decomposition, and then the phosphorus hadn't had time to be immobilized through adsorption. And then there's a photo I took of the reed canary grass. So for our conclusion, we found that the soil pH was directly linked to nutrient cycling, that the upper wetland and the Army Corps of Engineer wetland that had the normal soil pHs for this area were the highest functioning wetlands in terms of carbon sequestration and nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations. And then yearly monitoring may help determine if those phosphorus concentrations in the Army Corps of Engineers wetlands were directly related to those herbicide treatments. When it came to carbon sequestration, we found that the constructed wetlands sampled could be potential sources for carbon sink. And then in the tiered wetland, that cells that were observed holding water over the sampling and monitoring period had overall higher concentrations of carbon compared to the terrestrial landscape around it. However, the low phosphorus and low pH in the tiered wetland may be limiting the growth of plants. The limited growth of plants may result in slower nutrient cycling and carbon sequestration. And finally, methane output, which was not measured during this research period, would need to be measured to determine the true net carbon balance of each wetland. And questions? Yes.
So, you found considerable range in the pH. And what do you know about like plant tolerance to pH? I mean, pH from 6 to 8. Do most plants can they handle that? And also like soil invertebrates, can they handle that kind of range? Or is this, would a 6 pH be really tough for some organisms to live in?
Well, I'm not quite sure on the organisms, this part, but for the plants, the pH between it's 6.5 and 8, the nutrients are really available for them at that point to uptake. And you're starting to get down into those lower pHs, phosphorus starts to get tied up and then it's not available to the plant. We found one spot in the wetland, in the tiered wetland, that the pH was 4.93, and then at that point, Dr. Sloan said that we could be looking at aluminum toxicity at that point. So the tiered wetland was really interesting in terms of low pH, but as far as plant availability, that 6.5 to 8 point range is really good for them to be able to take up.
Because I mean, you assume as you go, higher and higher in acidity, that itself will be toxic, right? I mean, all the hydrogen could affect the plants, right? Or is it not usually a problem? Not at 6, but let's say at 3 or 4.
Yeah, you wouldn't find pH values like that. Usually, once you get below 5.5, you start having problems with aluminum toxicity in regards to the plants. Yeah, so important. And the microbial activity in the soil.
Cool.
So 6 was kind of red flag, but it wasn't necessarily super problematic.
Right.
For the plants at that point, at least.
Right. You'd probably like to see, the plants would probably like to see something better, but
right.
It's not detrimental.
We have some online questions.
Sure.
So the first one is, what about loss of nutrients in outflowing water?
Well, Faith Van Winkle is presenting behind me, and she did her research on nutrient cycling in these wetlands, so she'll probably address those questions.
Okay, Dr. Liz Hassenmuller wants to know, she said maybe she missed this, but was the main water source what was the main water source for each of the wetlands, rain, etc.?
Okay, the tiered wetland was mostly surface flow. In the upper wetland, there was one inlet, but it was just like an ephemeral stream, so it wasn't a major source of flow, of input. And then surface flow on that, and then the Army Corps of Engineers was just surface flow.
One more question from online, and then I think Phil has a question. This one's from Dr. Lisa Welp. How do your wetland soil organic carbon concentrations compare to typical ag soils or other land use types?
Well, we were planning to go out and sample an ag field. It's 500 acres over in Calhoun County that's slated to become a wetland, but then the weather didn't cooperate because we had that 3 weeks where we had 10 inches of rain, and then it went underwater. So we weren't able to answer that question, unless Dr. Sloan may know.
Yeah, you said it's 2 to 5 typically, so these are kind of at the low end, but not super low.
What was the invasive species composition on each site? Were these sites kind of, I saw they had the one Army Corps site was being sprayed, looked like they had a pretty significant amount of reed canary grass. Were they all kind of?
Yeah, there was a significant amount of reed canary grass in the upper wetland. And then in the tiered wetland, there was multiflora rose, bush honeysuckle, and Japanese hops. Those were the primary 3 that I saw. They wasn't like too bad of a percentage of invasive species covered, but I did notice some while we were down there. Any others? All right, and then Faith, who did work in the same wetlands, will be up next.